Kubernetes is one of the most important things I would recommend you to learn in 2022. In this video, we will discuss about why you should learn Kubernetes, what is the best way to learn Kubernetes, and where can you run Kubernetes for free. And to help, to represent you, we have Pawan, who is going to ask all the questions out to me. Thanks a lot, Pawan, for agreeing to host this session. I'm glad to have you in here.
Hey, thanks, Anga. The opportunity that you gave, the pleasure is mine. Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. So let's get started. The most, simple question, why do I need Kubernetes? Why?
Yeah, I think if you look at the last few years, right, we have evolved to microservices architecture. A lot of enterprises are using something like a microservices architecture today, right?
Yes,
And when we have microservices architecture, we have a number of microservices which are present,
yes,
right? Each of these microservices are pretty complex. They have complex communication needs. And there
yes,
are also a lot of non-functional requirements also that are present along with the microservices, right?
yes,
Let's look at a few requirements, right? If I'm, let's say, having 5 different microservices, each of them might have different scaling needs, right?
yes,
One microservice might have a lot of users, the other microservice might not have. So you'd want to be able to automatically scale the microservices, automatically increase the number of specific microservices based on the load which is coming into a specific microservice. And also, if you look at like these microservices, they would need to be able to identify where a specific other microservice is located. You would need something like service discovery, where I can
yes,
register, oh, hey, this is where I am, and other microservices can discover me and they can talk with me when they need to, right?
exactly.
When I have multiple microservices present, like let's say I have microservice one and there are 10 instances of the microservice, and there's
Yes,
a microservice two which wants to talk to microservice one. Now you would want to also have load balancing, right? I
yeah,
have 10 instances, I would want to load balance between those instances. And uh, there are a lot of other requirements. Like for example, if a instance of a microservice goes down, right? You don't want to be able to discover that and replace it with a healthy instance. So you
yes,
want things like self healing. You'd want to also be able to release new versions, right? Let's say microservice one. Right now I'm release one. I want to go to release two. I would want to be able to do that with as minimum downtime, if possible, with zero downtime. So if I
yes,
have 100 instances of a microservice one, I want to slowly migrate, like maybe 5 instances first, test it like a proper, maybe you'd want to have an advanced release strategy and implement features like that, right? So if you look at like containers help us to standardize the creating of images and like running containers, right? Whether it's a Python image or a Docker image, I mean Python image or a like a Node.js application or a Java
yes,
application.
yes,
Containers help us to standardize that, and Kubernetes for me helps you to build the layer on top of it to enable most of the non-functional features that are needed for microservices, right?
yes,
So things
yes.
like auto scaling, service discovery, load balancing, self-healing, and release management. These are some of the important features that Kubernetes provides.
Definitely, definitely. Yeah. So since I know now, okay, why do I need Kubernetes? So I would definitely ask my question. Okay, what are the applications of it? Where all can I use it and how?
Yeah. So if you look at like anywhere you are using microservices architecture, right? So anywhere you are running a lot of containers and it's very, very difficult to manage it, right? There are other container orchestration alternatives, like simpler one, like Docker Compose. Maybe if you want to just run a few containers on your like, local machine, it's not container orchestration for me. Maybe something like Docker Swarm is an
Yes,
alternative, but
yes,
like the most popular option today to be able to run multiple containers is Kubernetes, right? The biggest advantage of Kubernetes today is you can run Kubernetes inside on a local machine. I mean, I would not recommend that, but if you want, you can run a Kubernetes cluster on your local machine. You can run it inside a data center, like an
yes,
enterprise data center. You can probably set up a Kubernetes cluster and run it. And
yes,
the easiest place today to run Kubernetes would be the cloud, right? Irrespective of the cloud, like whether you're talking about Google Cloud, Azure, or even AWS, right? So
yes,
all these provide container orchestration solutions. Google Cloud has, for example, this GKE, Google
yes,
Kubernetes Engine. Azure has AKS, Azure
yes.
Kubernetes Service, and
Services.
like Elastic Container Service for Kubernetes is what AWS offers, EKS, right? So yeah, so there, like you can, the best place for me, if I have to recommend one place where you would learn Kubernetes, you want to start learning Kubernetes, I would say GKE is the simplest one to set up and start learning Kubernetes.
Cool, cool. Yeah. So on because I as you started with the video saying okay, it is taking a huge transformation and evolution, and software industry is moving towards it. So who all do you think need to understand the concept of Kubernetes and get started with it?
Right. So if you look at Kubernetes, right? So typically, like the complex parts when it comes to Kubernetes are a setting up the cluster. Right. Setting up a
Yes.
Kubernetes cluster is a big pain everywhere,
Yes.
and the other thing which is really complex is understanding the architecture of Kubernetes. Right. So typically, I would say the testing team might not really worry about Kubernetes at all, but developers and the operations team, like both of them, should have maybe for a testing team having a high level understanding of what Kubernetes is more than sufficient. But for operations team, how to manage the Kubernetes cluster is a very, very, very important part. How to manage the security of the cluster. How do you manage the security of the containers which are deployed to the cluster? What should be enabled or not? I think those would
Yes.
be the important things which are points of focus from the operations team. And for development team, again, I mean, probably if you are running it in the cloud, probably developers can try and create clusters in the cloud. And then like it's important to understand what are the like how do you deploy a container to Kubernetes? How do you enable communication between containers? And also the all the non-functional features that we were talking about, right? So all those features, how do you make use of them? So those would
Yes.
be some of the things that developers need to focus on. So yeah, it does help. Like once you have Kubernetes in place, it helps you to standardize a lot of things. But Kubernetes is not, I wouldn't say it's an easy thing to learn. It takes a little while to learn. If you're a developer, probably you'd want to create a cluster in the cloud and focus on trying to deploy one container and probably slowly probably deploy a couple of containers there, like try to scale them, try to get them to talk to each other. So those are the things that probably somebody can try.
Exactly. Exactly. Good. Good. So okay, since we have talked about so many things, I want to understand the journey of Kubernetes. How did it evolve throughout the time?
Okay, okay. So if you look at Kubernetes, right, it started at Google. I think it was called Borg. I think
Hmm.
that's, I
Yes. Yes.
don't exactly remember the name. And then
Hmm.
I think Kubernetes, like Google open sourced it. And I think
Yes.
now it's under CNCF, right? So that's where it is. It's open source, it's part of CNCF. And you have offerings of Kubernetes on each of the clouds. So
Yes.
that's like initially it was like, yeah, we took time to graduate to Kubernetes. But once people understood the value that Kubernetes provides. Even though it's difficult to set up Kubernetes clusters, a lot of people are now making use of Kubernetes, right? And today, like I think running Kubernetes is much more easier because a lot of enterprises also make use of the cloud and they make use of one of the services which are provided by the cloud provider.
Yes. So as a beginner, I would definitely have a doubt. Okay, how do I get started? How do I learn
Right.
Kubernetes? Right. So what is the recommendation that you have for someone like?
Yeah. See, running Kubernetes cluster on a local machine is very, very difficult, right? If it was Docker, I think you can easily run a container on the local machine using Docker, but setting up a Kubernetes cluster on a local machine, I would definitely not recommend. So if you want to learn Docker, I would definitely recommend Google Cloud. So go ahead, create a free tier Google Cloud account, and probably go ahead and create a Kubernetes cluster there. So you can create a GKE cluster just with a click of few buttons. And I would say, like, take one of the applications you are working with, or one of your pet applications that you are playing with, and try and create a container for it and deploy it to Kubernetes. And
Yes.
then you can play around with most of the other Kubernetes features, right? So you'd want to probably try and create multiple instances, probably have a couple of instances talk to each other. So that's where you would go, like that's where you would start. So I would recommend you to create a cluster in the cloud and try and deploy something to get started.
Cool, cool, awesome. So I know that in the beginning you just started and mentioned just few advantages of the Kubernetes. Do you want to get in more detail of it? Like more. What are the other things that exist as advantages of Kubernetes other than what you have mentioned and stuff?
Yeah. So if you look at Kubernetes, right, one of the best practices when it comes to Kubernetes is to follow declarative configuration, right? So
Mhm.
what is declarative configuration? Like if I want to deploy a container, like I can actually execute a few commands and deploy a container. But
Yes.
the problem is in the long run, if you want to deploy to another environment, then you have to execute the same commands again, and you have to remember the sequence of commands. And like it's an imperative style. You are actually saying, okay, I would want to deploy a container, right? It's an imperative style. Uh, on the other hand, when we go to declarative style, it's more like you would say, I want this. And what happens is you compare against whatever is on the Kubernetes cluster. So let's say right now there are 5 instances in
Yes.
a Kubernetes cluster for a specific microservice or a specific container. In a
Mm-hmm.
declarative configuration, if I just put 6 and if I apply that,
Mm-hmm.
it would compare 6 versus 5, and it would see that there are like okay, there is one less instance, it would increase the number of instances. Or if you want to make a change in configuration for a container, right? If you're
Yes.
using declarative configuration, probably you just say, okay, this is the configuration I would want to apply. It would check all the configurations, see what has changed, and just apply the changes. This would also help us when we go to the next environment, right? Once I have declarative configuration, once I have a configuration which works in one environment, let's say dev,
Yes.
I
Yes.
can easily use the declarative configuration YAML. Like typically in Kubernetes, we would use YAML, right? So
Yes.
you can use the declarative configuration and use the same thing to deploy it to multiple environments.
Environments.
So yeah, so for me, like declarative configuration is one of the best practices when it comes to like Kubernetes. It's recommended always. I mean, when you're playing with it, probably you want to use commands, kubectl, and things like that to play with
Yes.
Kubernetes. But when you are really using something in production, declarative configuration is must have, right? So that's
Definitely.
one thing. And another thing that probably somebody who's starting with Kubernetes might want to focus on a little bit once you get familiar with Kubernetes and all the concepts around it is the concept of service mesh, right? For me, service mesh is a concept which makes Kubernetes really, really powerful, right? So
Yes. Yes.
by
Exactly.
having like a lot of non-functional features, like a lot of non-functional features can be very, very easily implemented by running a sidecar container beside each of the microservices, right? So you can actually have something like logging, distributed tracing, like
Yes.
all the
Yes.
logs get streamed to the same place. All the tracing information can be sent anywhere, and you can, yeah, you can probably implement a service mesh like Istio. Istio is a very,
Yes.
very popular service mesh framework, right? So you can implement something like that, and even implement advanced release management strategies, right? So if you want to like simple kind of release strategies, Kubernetes does support just using YAML, like just using the declarative configuration. But if you want really advanced ones, then you can also use something like a service mesh to really control completely your
Exactly.
release management, right? So yeah,
Yes.
that's where those are the concepts you'd want to go to once you are really, really familiar with Kubernetes. Maybe even uh, Helm, right? Helm is
Yes.
another
Exactly.
important concept you might want to go to once you are past the beginner level when it
Of the
comes to
Kubernetes.
Kubernetes, right?
Yes.
If you look at declarative configuration files, the YAML files for microservices, probably there is a lot of duplication, right? You don't want so
Yes.
much duplication in applications at all. And Helm makes it simple. I mean,
Yes.
Helm helps you to avoid the duplication that
So
you have
duplication of the configuration. Yes.
exactly around the configuration. So those would be some of the things that I think somebody who is familiar with Kubernetes and wants to go to advanced stuff probably can touch upon.
So just like Docker, we were talking about, right? And so even Kubernetes has a very typical networking configuration stuff going around, right? So
Right,
do you want to
absolutely.
throw some more light on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you are having a container, I mean, if you have a, like, for example, if you have a cluster and you have multiple containers which are deployed, which might be
Yes.
belonging to multiple microservices, right?
Hmm.
So then it becomes very, very important to like, I mean, one thing is controlling the network, like access to the cluster itself.
Hmm.
That's important. Another thing is what can be the communication that can happen with the containers which are present, right? So if I have
Yes.
microservice one containers, microservice two containers, what kind of communication do you want to allow? So those are the kinds of things that Kubernetes networking allows. You can configure network policies and you can say, okay, this microservice can talk to this one, this cannot talk to this one, or things like that. So networking is very, very important when it comes to Kubernetes. Also, networking is important when you want to expose it to the outside world. You have an application which is running in the container. Maybe you'd want to expose it on a specific, like you want to expose it, you want to enable external world to call it, right?
Yes.
So you'd
Yes.
want to probably expose a service around it, right? So
Yes.
things like that are what networking would enable you to do.
Definitely. So do you want to throw some more light on some basic concepts of Kubernetes? Something like okay, I look a lot of names called like a pod. Okay, what is a pod? Or
Yeah,
I look around namespace. Okay, what is a namespace? Right.
yeah.
So yeah,
I think now
and
we are
just we
getting into
were
some of the yeah. I think now we are getting into some of the tricky stuff with respect to Kubernetes, right?
yes, yes,
Understanding the basics of Kubernetes is very, very important. Things like understanding what is deployment, what is a replica set, what is a
Yes.
pod, right? These are
Yes.
some of the most fundamental things that are part of a like Kubernetes thing, right? So let's say
Yes.
I'll probably touch upon some important things, right? So
Yes.
let's say I'm creating a microservice. I would want to have 5 instances of it, right? So what I would do is I would probably execute a command saying I would want to create a deployment. The deployment would
Exactly.
internally create something called a replica set, right?
Yes.
And replica set would be, let's say, I say I would want to create this microservice with 3 instances. So I'm creating a deployment saying I would want to create a deployment. This microservice, this is the container image. I would want 3 instances.
Yes.
And the deployment would be created. And also in parallel with it, there is a replica set which is being created. We'll talk why
Yes.
we have deployment and replica set a little later. But
Exactly.
it would create a deployment and a replica set. And
Yes.
as part of the replica set, there would be 3 pods. Each of the instance of the microservice, each container instance of a microservice is what we call a pod,
Pod.
right? So now we have a deployment inside which you have a replica set, inside which you have 3 pods. So
Yes.
that's the structure right now, right? So now let's say I would want to move on to a next version of the microservice.
Yes.
So let's say I would want to upgrade, like right now I'm at the V1 of a microservice, I would want to upgrade to V2 of a
V2.
microservice, right? So now what would happen? Like I don't want to probably replace the entire V1 and go to V2 at one point. Probably
Yes.
I would want to have the V1 running and V2 in parallel. Probably I'd want
Yes.
to first test 1 instance of V2 and 2 instances of V1. If it's working, then I would want to go. In those kind of situations, you can probably configure a release strategy. That would be too advanced to discuss right now. Probably
Yes.
we'll just say, I'm updating a deployment, right? As soon as
Yes.
I update a deployment with a new image, what
Mhm.
happens is, in addition to the existing replica set, there would be another replica set which is created. And
Yes.
that replica set would represent a specific release.
Mhm.
So V1 replica set would be there, V2 replica set would be there, and inside the V2 replica set, you would have a new pod which is created, which
Yes.
represents the new release. So
Yes.
for me, like that's how it's better to understand. You have a deployment which represents a microservice. You have replica sets which represent each microservice version,
Mhm.
and you have pods which represent a specific version, I mean,
Microservice
specific
running.
instance, container
Mhm.
instance of a specific version of a microservice.
Yes.
So at
Yes.
a high level, that's how I think about the whole thing, right? So the reason why there is deployment and replica set is because when I move from one release to another release, I would want to have a smooth transition. I don't want any
Transition.
downtime. So
Yes.
that's
Yes.
where deployment strategies come into picture. So having
Yes.
replica sets, I think that's one place where Kubernetes did a really, really good job. These concepts are difficult to understand, but once you understand them, right? Maybe like the viewers might not have understood it completely just based on this. What I would do is I will also link to a video on Kubernetes in the
Mhm.
description, right?
Mhm.
That would have a clear understanding, like a video which you can look at, and you can probably dig deeper into each of these concepts, right? Understanding what is a replica set, what is a deployment, what is a pod, are very, very important when it comes to Kubernetes.
Yes, yes. So also coming back to the most important aspects of Kubernetes, I know even Kubernetes helps us in enabling security, right?
Right.
And also load balancing. There are so many strategies coming around
Yeah.
it. So do you want to talk more about some
Yeah,
stuff on it?
exactly. So if you look at the basic release strategies, right?
Mhm.
So most of them are like the basic ones you can do it just with like basic declarative configuration.
Rollout, yeah,
But if
yeah.
you, yeah, but if you want advanced ones like blue bin deployment or things like that,
Mhm.
probably you would want to go with a service mesh, and it
Yes.
gives you more control over the deployments, right?
Mhm.
So yeah, I think at a high level, basic releases is like what you would start with. If you are learning Kubernetes, probably you would buy, like whenever you are like changing, like whenever you are setting a new deployment, I mean whenever you are updating a deployment to a new image, what is happening is the basic rollout, right? So
Yes.
but if you want advanced complete control over what's how the transition from one release to another release is
Another this
happening,
happens. Yes.
yeah, you would probably need to go with some like service mesh like a STO or things like that.
So about load balancing. Uh,
Right.
yes.
Yeah, load
So
balancing is something which is inbuilt in Kubernetes, right? So
Kubernetes.
it's, you don't really need to do a lot of complex things to get load balancing. All that you need to know is the service name. Once you have the service name of whichever microservice you'd want to, I mean microservice or the deployment you'd want to like communicate with, it's easy. You just need to make use of that specific thing, because automatically whenever we actually create a deployment, it would be registered with the Kubernetes like naming, whatever the internal naming service for Kubernetes, and
Mhm.
you would have other microservices can use the service name to talk to the microservice. So
Ex-
typically, implementing, if you go back, implementing load balancing, you need an additional load balancer and things like that. But if you're just wanting, if you just want simple load balancing between microservices, uh, then Kubernetes can do that very well in a very, very
yes.
simple way.
Yes. So coming back to the thing that where you mentioned, the Kubernetes is completely declarative, right? So I see the advantage of it, when developers or ops teams come into the picture, right? They don't have to actually set up the networking, right? They have declarative advantage over declaring a policy, network policy, right? So
Exactly,
do you want to
exactly.
talk more about network policy and things like that on the
Yeah, so
Kubernetes?
if you look at declarative configuration, right? So declarative configuration is the one which is the most important part, right? So as part of declarative configuration, you can configure release strategies, you can configure your network policies, you can configure whatever you want to configure around your deployments, right?
Yes.
Everything can be configured in the deployment, I mean, in your declarative configuration. Once you have that, uh, and it's working in dev, you can use the same thing across all the environments. So it
Yes.
makes the job of an operations team very, very simple. Or, I mean, there's very, very minimum chance, there is very, very less chance that you would actually make a mistake, right?
Yes.
So it's whenever we go to operations, it's all about repeatability, right?
Yes.
Repeatability is very, very important. Like if something worked in QA, it should work in
And prod.
staging environment. It should work in prod. Being able to repeat the same thing across is very, very important, and that's where I think declarative configuration plays a critical role.
Exactly, exactly. So circling back to a word where you mentioned sidecar container, okay, which basically links up to service mesh and Istio, right? So do you
Yeah,
want to
exactly.
let's talk more about Istio and service mesh and what is a sidecar container? What is it doing exactly? Where is
Exactly.
it
Yeah.
sitting?
Exactly. So let's say I have 10 microservices, right? So probably what I would want to do is I would want to probably get logs from all of them and stream them to a single place.
Mhm.
Uh, Probably I would also want to trace the communication which is happening among these microservices. Microservice one is calling microservice two. I would want to, uh, I don't want to write code in microservice one uh, explicitly logging somewhere or explicitly tracing somewhere. So these are all common features across microservices, tracing, logging, and there are a lot of such features, right?
Mhm.
So you don't want to implement them in each of the microservices.
Yes,
The best approach would be to probably implement them in some common place, right? What's that common place? That common place is what we call as a sidecar container. So what we would do is probably I mean, I'm talking very, very high level, abstract level. So you would actually have some kind of logic to do where you have all the common features that you'd want across microservices. Maybe
definitely.
sometimes even service discovery and things like that also happen to the sidecar container. So you'd have all that features as part of your sidecar container, and these sidecar containers can be deployed beside each of the container instance of the microservice. So each container instance of a microservice, if I have microservice one with 5 instances, 5 container instances, each of them will have one container right beside it, and that container is what is called a sidecar container, right? So
Yes,
that would take care of all the common features that are needed by all the microservices. So all microservices now have something sitting beside them to take care of the common features. But how do you get them there? How do you get the common containers there? How do you enable the communication? That's where you go for a concept called service mesh. A service
yes,
mesh enables you to easily configure, okay, I would want to deploy sidecar containers for all these microservices, right? And these are the features that I would want to have as part of
enable.
the sidecar
Yes,
container. Exactly. So I would want to control what the sidecar container does. So that
yes,
is what the service mesh enables us to do. Service mesh, and one of the popular sidecar container implementations is Istio, right? So
Istio.
that's yeah. And just before we end this, right? So one of the important thing I would want to touch upon, Pawan, is also the multi-cloud capabilities that Kubernetes brings in,
Yes,
right?
yes,
So
yes.
if you look at things like Anthos, right?
Mhm.
Anthos is a service which is provided by Google Cloud, and you can use that to run to manage Kubernetes clusters which are present. Let's say you create one Kubernetes cluster in AWS, you can have one Kubernetes cluster in Azure, you can have one Kubernetes cluster in Google Cloud, one on your data center, one directly in your data center,
Yes,
and you can control all that from a central place. Like for example, you have a Anthos configured. If you're making use of Anthos service from Google Cloud, from
yes,
single place, you can manage all the clusters which are present in there. And that's something really, really powerful, right? Tomorrow, you are not dependent on a specific cloud provider.
Cloud. Yes.
Your workloads can run wherever you would want. Let's say,
Yes.
like these kind of multi-cloud capabilities are is what Kubernetes enables, right? So that's why Kubernetes is one of the most popularly used things. And like whenever I talk about Kubernetes, I would say, okay, it's definitely something which a lot of people should learn, because it's widely used in the industry right now, and I think the adoption of Kubernetes is only going to grow from here, right? So
Yes.
it's
Yes. Exactly.
only like the number of enterprises which are adopting Kubernetes is growing by the day, right?
Yes.
So yeah, it's very very important. And especially with the emergence of cloud, I think container orchestration is becoming very very important, because they simplify multi-cloud.
Yes.
They like make going to like having flexibility while you are migrating to the cloud easier, right? So those
Yes.
are the reasons, some of the reasons why I think Kubernetes is getting really, really popular.
Cool, cool. I think I'm at the words of my questions. I think I've pretty much asked so many frequently asked questions, and
Okay,
I think whoever is going to get started right with things like Kubernetes and stuff, I would definitely recommend them to go through the technical terms. Basically, like just you are describing what is a pod, what is a deployment, right? They
exactly.
might be confused exactly. So I would recommend them to go to official website, maybe
Yeah,
read the definitions of them, and
absolutely. I mean, I love the Kubernetes documentation page. It's
yes,
wonderful. And if
it's fun to
uh,
read.
absolutely, it's lovely. It's lovely. I mean, a lot of times, I mean, obviously, right, when you work with Kubernetes, you can't be a master of it. Uh,
Yes.
and whenever I have a question, the first place I go to is a Kubernetes documentation.
Yes.
It's an amazing place to go to.
So, do you want to talk about some tricks and tips that developers who are working even with Kubernetes might not have known something like that? No,
I
maybe.
think
Hmm.
I mean, probably tips and tricks is the wrong word, but I would think some of the best practices with respect to using Kubernetes.
Uh-huh.
I think definitely like use something like help, like
Yes.
like yeah, it's like the more microservices or the more containers you create, managing declarative configuration for all of them becomes a
Very
challenge.
difficult. Yes.
And definitely, I would recommend to go with something like Helm. And also, like service mesh is something which almost everybody makes use of, right? I would not call
Yes.
it a best practice because it's kind of mandatory. And also, declarative configuration, I would not really call it a best practice as such, because there is no other option.
Yes.
If you are going to deploy to Kubernetes, like yeah, you have to go for declarative configuration. So those would be the things I would recommend.
So one such I would definitely not recommend doing this in a prod or any other environment, but locally, if at all somebody is trying to do or develop something, right? There is one such trick up the sleeve of Kubernetes, which did not realize until I have seen it with my eyes, that I can do a kubectl edit of the configuration right when it is running.
Right, absolutely.
That use enormous power for me when I'm developing something, right? I
Yeah,
don't have
yep.
to go back and deploy everything all out again. I can just do it on the go.
Yeah, yeah, it's
So,
good, as you said. I mean, it's okay when
it's a
you
dirty
do it.
one.
Yeah, exactly. It's not something which you would recommend because it's not
No,
declarative, it's
no,
imperative,
definitely not.
right?
Yeah,
But
definitely not.
that's the flexibility Kubernetes provides, right? While you are learning, like that's a tip which we actually frequently make use of, in the sense
Yes.
that first we execute a command, and once you have the command executed and once you know everything is working,
Yes.
then you can get the declarative script by like just using a few commands, right? So you'd be able to
Yes.
get the declarative configuration for it, and then obviously you need to yeah, make sure that the declarative configuration is good. And uh, there'll be a lot of default stuff which would be added in. Probably you need to remove that out, but that's something which I would definitely recommend, right? So once you
Yes.
start with imperative style, to get to the declarative style, you can export the configuration and kind of get the configuration and start editing the configuration, right? So
Yes.
yeah, that's something which I would definitely recommend people to do.
It's just in development. That's all. Nowhere
Yeah,
else.
only in development, only while you are learning. When you are
Yes.
learning, you have the flexibility to do that, not in production.
Yes, definitely. Because what will happen is, for example, say I'm trying to establish a network policy, right? So now I'll have to try various iterations to understand. Okay, what is exactly happening with
Exactly.
network policy, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
So
So
yes,
imperative is good when you're playing with it, when you're trying to understand it, when you don't
yes,
know something, and when you are having a quick challenge and you want to immediately address it.
yes,
It's okay.
definitely.
But it's very, very important to make sure that that is updated into your declarative
Declarative
configuration and
format.
check your configuration management. right? When you are talking about best practices, right? Having declarative configuration as part of your configuration management is very, very important.
Yes.
So it should be in your version control somewhere.
Yes, yes. So I think we missed an important part of Kubernetes. It's called service, which is the core heart, which basically enables us to
Exactly. So once you
export.
have a deployment, the way, like we were touching upon it when we were talking about networking, actually, right?
Yes,
So
yes,
when you have a deployment, you'd want to expose it to the outside world, or you'd want to enable it communication with it even within the Kubernetes cluster.
yes,
You can
cluster.
actually
Yeah,
create a service around the deployment, which, for example, the service you can think of service like a load balancer, right? So
exactly.
something like that, right? I'm simplifying it, right? Service is not exactly equal to a load
Not
balancer,
load
but
balancer. Yeah.
for a starter, I think that's a good analogy to start with, right?
Mhm.
So you have a microservice, you have multiple instances, you can create a service around it, and you can expose it to the outside world so that, let's say, some microservice which is external to your cluster would want to talk to it. That's something which service enables.
Because I've seen that to be a common gacha around people who are trying to learn Kubernetes. They have pod, they have deployment, but they don't have service in their deployment. Now they are unable to communicate with it. I'm like, how
Exactly,
do I hit it?
exactly. Yeah, exactly. So once Kubernetes also is easy to start, right? You just create a deployment. You don't need to worry about what a replica set is, what a
Yes,
pod is.
yes,
You need to
yes,
understand them eventually. But
yes.
to start off, you'd just say kubectl create deployment. You'd say kubectl create expose deployment. You don't
Yes.
even need to know that you are creating a service. You
Service,
just say
exactly.
kubectl expose deployment, and you are ready.
Yes, yes. Cool. So I think we have touched upon almost all the aspects of the Kubernetes, and we have
Cool.
talked advanced concepts like Helm, STO, service mesh. I
Yeah.
think I'm good. So yep, that's a wrap for
Thanks a
me.
lot, Pawan. Thanks a lot
Yeah.
for hosting this for me. Really appreciate it. And if any of the learners have additional questions we would want on Kubernetes, on how to learn Kubernetes or some other important concepts around Kubernetes, they can post it in the post it in the comments. And yeah, we would check the comments, and probably we would create a little bit more content around that. Thanks a lot, Pawan, for hosting me.
Thanks,
And
Ranga.
I'll
Pleasure
see
is
you
mine.
again very, very soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.